The events of today's story take place on March 13th, 2023, when my wife and I went out for pizza and in turn accidentally witnessed Chinese government officials talking to a Micronesian governor about obtaining help in their coming war for Taiwan. And what's worse, the pizza wasn't even all that good. Today's episode takes place on the island of Kashrai, which I understand is a very obscure place, so perhaps it's best I start with a bit of background. The word Micronesia means two things. It's both a country and a region. The country, called the FSM, or more formally the Federated States of Micronesia, is a collection of loosely united islands formed around semi-independent tribal kingdoms. It would take an entire video, at least as long as this one, to even begin to explain the complexity of their politics, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to summarize their system as fractured. But speaking of fractured, the FSM is also only one of a number of countries that make up the region of Micronesia. It's the historic homeland of the Micronesians, as you might imagine. And not that there's going to be a quiz on it or anything, but the other countries that comprise this region are the Kiribati, otherwise known as the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Nauru, and Palau, which itself had originally been a state in the FSM until it declared independence in the 90s. And although on paper none of those except the Marianas are directly controlled by Washington, in practice it would be fair to say that since the Second World War, every single country in this region, at least geopolitically speaking, exists because of and at the mercy of the United States. Or at least, they did. Okay, back to dinner. It's not even 5 p.m. and my wife already wants to eat. I'm going to call her Kata from now on because that's her name. Kata is a high-maintenance woman, by which I mean after 3 nights in a row of the same fish burger at the same hotel restaurant, she asked if I wanted to try the island's other restaurant. I know, she's a diva, but that's just Kata. Also, she's not an 1800s Protestant, so I don't really understand why she eats so early, but we've been married long enough that we're well accustomed to each other's forms of crazy, and so at 4:50 on the dot, we're both walking down the road to the only other restaurant on this island. It's called the Bully Hayes, which feels like a bold name for a restaurant because he's a famous turn-of-the-century rapist, although I suppose he must have been a big fan of pizza because that's what they serve. The Bully, restaurant, not the man, is run as part of Kajrai's second hotel, a series of relatively well-maintained cabins called the Tree Lodge Resort. A resort that, as it turns out, kind of contains a little bit of drama all its own, sort of a story within this story. Of all the people I spoke to in Kashrai, virtually every single one of them went well out of their way to tell me that, at least as of this filming, that resort is now being run by the government, or more specifically, the family of the new lieutenant governor. I believe that they own the land beneath it in a tribal sense, although I don't actually know that for certain. That's just what people said. But what I do know is that they definitely weren't the ones who built it. Few would say exactly what happened, but this is a small island. Nobody wants that blowback. So I did a bit of snooping online, and as it turns out, you can still see the drama laid out on their Facebook page in the form of a heartfelt message to the foreigner who'd built the place, saying it was a shame that the new owners stole it from him for the COVID money. Rule number 1 of stealing a resort is that you're going to want to get the Facebook password. But my point of reveling in this small island drama isn't because I really actually care who runs the place. I'm sure it sucks for the old owner, but that's not exactly my battle. The reason I mention it is because it means that I wasn't super surprised when I showed up and the governor's truck was in the parking lot. And you could tell it was his truck for 2 reasons, too. 1, it was parked across like 2 1/4 spots, which feels like a real governor thing to do. And then 2, his license plate said governor. And here's the thing about opportunity, right? It knocks all the time. The trick is just being able to see it in that license plate. And on Kashrai, on March 13th, 2023, nothing could have knocked louder than that plate. Because 4 days earlier, David Panuelo, then president of Micronesia, had written the most politically important letter in that nation's history. He denounced China and recommended whoever succeed him swap over to supporting Taiwan formally. It was a scathing denunciation of foreign interference, 12 pages long. In that letter, he claimed that China was undertaking a deep and prolonged attack on his democracy. He said they were bribing politicians, buying them fancy trips to mainland cities, providing them targeted aid before elections, and when that didn't work, following their leaders to other countries and threatening them. He would later follow up and say that they're even possibly bringing in guns. Pompeians would even show me that the roads that they were building as aid were being constructed suspiciously identically to landing strips. And the reason for this targeted harassment, at least according to President Panuelo, is because they wanted a new ally in their coming war for Taiwan, or at the very least to disallow ships from the US from transiting through their waters in the case of that shooting actually starting. Which, as you might imagine, would be pretty bad for Taiwan. But what might not be so immediately clear is just how bad it would be for everybody else. Because after Fiji, the Kiribati, and the Solomon Islands have all made clear moves towards China, not to mention the Triad's attempted takeover of Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia have never been more important to US policy. Losing control of this region, losing the ability to transport troops and supplies through these waters, would effectively force a bottleneck of any US supply routes to Asia. US bases in South Korea, Taiwan, Okinawa, Japan, the Philippines, Kwajalein, Guam, Hawaii, it threatens them all. Not to mention, of course, the countries that host them. For China to be able to diplomatically take these islands would be a huge deal. It would mean Chinese military influence stretching from Hong Kong to Honolulu. It might not have been in so many words, but that's what that letter said. And there is no way a superpower like China is just going to let that happen without some form of response. Okay, it's 5:10 p.m. and we're entering the Bully Haze. Again, restaurant, not the man. It's empty, of course. No Micronesian eats this early. Well, empty except for one table. At the head of the room, 4 people sit around chatting. 2 of them Micronesians, one clearly the governor, that much is obvious from his demeanor, and his aide, a man I would later learn to be a member of his family, which, if you understand Micronesia, totally makes sense, especially in Koh Rai. I'm talking about an island with a few thousand people, and family means everything to Micronesians. It's a very understandable thing. It's a small-scale corruption that nobody would ever expect to be different. But on the other side of the table are 2 Hawaiian-dressed, very articulate, and clearly important Chinese dignitaries. They speak, well, actually only one of them ever speaks, but when he does so, he speaks in fluent American accented English. You can imagine that his assistant is not a member of his family. So we sit down, and against my every instinct, I shut up. Kata knows the plan, I don't need to say it. We sit close enough to listen, but not so close as to make it look deliberate. We tend the sort of terse conversation that only 2 people married for 15 years can achieve. And in turn, we hear every word they say. Even as they speak so softly, it becomes a near whisper. But beyond that, I was a bit confused about what I was supposed to do, really, if anything at all. Because it wasn't like they were doing something exactly illegal, at least not in a sense that anyone would ever follow up on. But at the same time, this was something worth witnessing. This was geopolitics in action. It was a backroom deal happening right before my eyes. And so I channeled my inner Bond, I suppose, and I had Kata take some stereotypical tourist photos of me with them over my shoulder. I recorded a bit of audio that turned out to be useless. Not really sure why or for who. At one point, I even got up to go introduce myself to the governor, to congratulate him on his recent win, just so I could be sure that it was him. Again, not really sure for who. But what would you have done? I'd never been a spy before. Didn't really know the protocol. Even before I'm in my seat, that man in the Hawaiian shirt was already changing the topic of conversation away from the letter, and not even tactfully either. I described their style of conversation as similar to like a theme park employee entertaining a lost child, asking stuff like, how many people does your island have? Do you have boats here? Were you occupied by the Japanese? Were they brutal? Which is a weird question for a theme park employee, but looking back, I don't think they asked a single thing that they didn't already know the answer to. For example, they literally watched the governor order pork and then seconds later asked if Micronesians ate pig. Yet even within all that, some of those questions still found a way to indict. For example, whenever they asked him, have you ever been to China? They did so in such a quiet tone, it might as well have been silent. That Hawaiian-shirted man, anytime he said China, he would drop the volume of that one word to a third of the rest of the sentence. It was uncanny. And yet, the governor did not seem to pick up on that, because he responded loudly with yes, he's been there 3 times, and he's hoping that they're going to bring him back again. Yet as inane as their questions were, with all the deflecting, they actually helped prove a great deal that they'd been meaning to hide. Because pointless though they might have been in one respect, in another they kind of allowed me to carve away all the other options for why those specific men would be having that specific conversation. Given the questions that they asked, they definitely couldn't be here to invest in the economy. They weren't businessmen, they weren't tourists, they weren't scientists, they weren't engineers, they weren't even philanthropists or teachers. The questions that they asked made all of that impossible. Because nobody in their right mind wouldn't already know the answers if they had even a penny on the line. It's like if an NBA point guard kept asking what the rubber egg was. It just didn't make sense. Simply put, the men in those Hawaiian shirts did not want me to overhear them talking about that letter. It's just they didn't seem to tell the governor their plan. Because as soon as their food arrives, he starts trying to drag the conversation back to the topic at hand. Not once, not twice, but 3 separate times he attempts to bring back up that letter. Never anything too direct, just a way to try to get their old conversation back on track. Stuff like, so how exactly do you want me to handle the Panuelo situation? Or the Attorney General's flying in tomorrow. He and I can discuss what to do about your problem. And yet, the only thing that those delegates will ever say on the topic of that letter after the initial sentence I sit down to is that they're going to be going to Chook State tomorrow, and they expect a similar outcome as here. And so, eventually, with their food finally eaten, the man in the Hawaiian shirt suggests continuing their conversation by the governor's vehicle, or perhaps in the quiet of a delegate's room. From there, the furthest I could follow them turned out to be the bathroom, and then I just sort of had to stand there peeing. Not something they often show you in the Bond films, although from the window of that bathroom I could see the governor and the main delegate walk off together in discussion while the 2 aides stayed behind to exchange phone numbers. And then from there, Kat and I quickly paid our bill so that we could hopefully walk past them and hear something, but it didn't work out. Life, as it turns out, not a movie. The next day, the delegates' flights got canceled, as flights in Kashrai often are, and they ended up forced to stay another day. 2, actually, although they won't know that until the next day when their flight is canceled a second time. But to fill that void, they're given a personal tour of the island by their new friend, the governor. And since it's a tiny place, we ended up meeting them again a bunch of times. We met them at breakfast, dinner, the clam farm, and twice just walking around. And every single time we did, the governor loudly introduced them to everyone there. Big wig Chinese government officials, he'd say. Super important. And here just to visit him. It was a lot to take in, which is why I did what I suspect any normal person would do in that environment, and I went out to a park, found some guys drinking, and got drunk with them. And after a couple of drinks, feeling a little bit loose, I ended up telling them the story of what I'd seen. And as I did, you could literally see the lights turn on in their brain, the eureka moment that they were all having. And they turned to me in excitement and said, just a few nights ago, in fact, the night that that letter dropped, they'd been out drinking with a friend of theirs, a family member of that governor, and he'd been bragging. He'd been bragging that China was pissed and that they were coming to, quote, make things right. And what he'd bragged about was that when they were coming here, it was to see his family, because now his family was in power. And in hearing my words, those boys also said, well, you should get in touch with the president. And one of them happened to have a family member who worked, I suppose, in the central government in Pompeii, and he gave me their contact information and said, send them a text with everything you just told us. Which, even in a drunken state, felt like a pretty big decision. Because even though I joke, to send that text, to make this video, was a really hard decision. It isn't as if I expect to be assassinated or something ridiculous like that, but at the same time, this is kind of war. It's just, it also isn't really my war. And in making that decision, I suppose in a tiny way, I faced what all of our societies are facing right now, especially the democracies. How much do we risk for Taiwan? The fact is, well, I don't personally agree that Taiwan is China's natural right any more than I do Hawaii is America's. It's not like my opinions will stop an army. That's what naval corridors do. And that's really why Micronesia matters. In fact, it's kind of why Taiwan matters. Headlines aside, this is not just about any specific island. This is about control of the entire ocean. This is about funneling the US Navy down considerably smaller lines of engagement. It's to open them up to submarines and missiles that they can't easily avoid. It's meant to weaken South Korea, Japan, Okinawa, Guam, and the Philippines and recreate the great Chinese sphere of influence that up until a few hundred years ago had always dominated this region. And it isn't only happening in the FSM. The norms of our world are being rewritten over pizza in every back corner of every Pacific island right now, from Taiwan to Tahiti. That's just how it is. And so, I sent that text. Not because I support the American domination of the Pacific, or the Kuomintang, or even the status quo. I know that the only reason that this video says Chinese spies instead of American, or Taiwanese, or even Japanese for that matter, is because those are the ones I happen to sit next to. Because this took place in 2023, and that's the opportunity that was knocking. There's a Cold War happening in the Pacific. Today. It's not yet being fought with guns. Thankfully, we're still at the stage where it's just steak dinners and trips to Hainan. But it is being fought through competing stores that dominate the economies, through infrastructure projects that look great for an ambitious politician, through aid strong enough to land an airplane. But every day, it leans more towards those guns. I'm not saying you have to agree with Taiwanese democracy just because I do. Frankly, these days it seems like most people's politics are just utopianisms that they've sharpened into knives so they can feel self-righteous stabbing you. Certainly the status quo is by no means a blessing, I get that, but it's the sudden shifts that I personally fear the most. Because history tells us that when there's a vacuum, things tend to suck. I personally wouldn't even really mind if China economically eclipsed the United States, just so long as it didn't lead to war. I wouldn't mind if Taiwan reunited with China, just so long as it was their decision. And I definitely don't mind when Micronesians play the two superpowers off each other to get a bigger payday. That's just playing your position. But that said, imperial transitions rarely happen peacefully. Individuals do matter, even on a geopolitical scale. When I sent that text, my contacts in the capital confirmed that it was exactly what I'd imagined it to be. They said they'd handle it behind the scenes, in what way I can't say, and then that was the last I'd ever heard of it. My story over just as soon as it began. It was kind of anticlimactic, really, something they never show you in the Bond films. But make no mistake, Micronesia matters, and an American Pacific is by no means a guarantee. One of the first things that Panuelo's replacement did after taking office was to reconfirm his country's positive relations with China, which I'd argue was a smart move because opportunity knocks all the time, and this is his. Far be it from me to say who should control the Pacific, but all I know is that we should pay attention when winds change in the ocean because I don't know about you, but personally, I'd rather not have to weather that storm. This is Rare Earth. This is pretty good pizza.
I need a urine sample. If you could fill the speaker for me.
From here?